All right. Hi, everyone. So welcome to another Saving Life on Earth webinar. This one is about saving monarchs and other insects. And I'm Brittany, and I'll be your host for today. My pronouns are she, hers, or she, her, and hers. And I am calling in from occupied Tohono O'odham land. I am the Saving Life on Earth campaigner. So you may have seen me on some of the other webinars that we've had. And I think I have a little introduction slide. I want to put that up just to kind of show you a little more about me. Yep. So I included in the photos that I had put on the little intro slide, which, boop. Anyways, there's a photo of me at speaking at the UN, where I was invited by the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to speak about the environmental impacts of the border wall. And I put that there because saving life on Earth, you know, that's anything from jaguars to tiny, cool little plants like the Sneed's pincushion cactus, or cacti, not plant. But just wanted to share some of why this is important to me. Oh, there we go. So there's a photo of me at the UN. I also include a land map from native-land.ca, which is where you can see what land you're residing on. And there's also a fun photo of me from many years ago in Thailand with some kind of beetle on my face that maybe Tara or Tierra might know what kind it is.
Looks like a rhinoceros beetle from here. Some kind of rhinoceros beetle.
It was a really big beetle, and it had little pinchers that held onto my nose ring, so that sounds like it would be that. So again, welcome. Before we begin, some tech notes for today are we've heard from y'all that the chat box gets really distracting, so we've disabled that. We'll have at least like 20 minutes for Q&A at the end of this. And then we'll be on Slack tomorrow, or Tara will be on Slack tomorrow from 12 to 1 p.m. Pacific time, answering any questions that may not have gotten answered during our Q&A session. And then you'll also be getting, after this video, an email with the recording of this webinar and an action alert on how you can help, which will be to sign a petition to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, urging them to protect the monarch under the Endangered Species Act. So with that, I'm going to pass to our guest speakers, Tierra and Tara, to introduce themselves.
All right, so this is me. Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I'm excited to see all these people coming on to learn about insects. So I grew up in Michigan, nearby Lake Michigan, about 30 minutes. So I was able to go camping when I was a kid, which was really fun. And while my family would make a straight beeline to the water, I would hang out more by the dune area and see these things. Let's see, we got the guy. They're coming. And so I would just hang out and see, there's pictures of beetles coming up for you guys. So I got really interested in beetles by exploring the dune areas along Michigan, and that just kind of became my love as a child. And so from there I went on to study ecology and conservation at Boston University, and I was able to study abroad in Ecuador and study dung beetles. And then I actually did my senior thesis on termites, so not quite beetles, but you know, insects. And then I went to San Francisco State University to continue studying beetles, and I started studying tiger beetles there in Point Reyes National Seashore, which I get to go back to dunes. And then because, there we go, beautiful, I became kind of a tiger beetle person in the area. I went to UC Santa Cruz for my PhD, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. And then just to kind of finish it up, I did a postdoc at the American Museum of Natural History, and then became a professor for a brief stint and studied pollinators and monarchs. And then after that, I really just realized I wanted to do more for conservation, more direct action, connecting science to policy. So I came to the center, and now I'm a senior scientist at the center in the Endangered Species Program, and started the Save the Insects campaign. So there you go.
Hey, I'm Tierra Curry. I'm a senior scientist at the center, and I get to work on a lot of cool species, but monarch butterflies are one of my favorites. So I'm excited to chat with you all today about monarchs.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all, for introducing yourselves. And with that, we will begin. And so the first question is for you, Tara, and it's, why are insects so important?
Okay. So first of all, there are lots of them, right? There's about 1 million species described so far, which results to be about 75% or more of animals on the planet. Just to give that perspective, there's like 40 to 50,000 known vertebrates. So that's like mammals, fish, birds, reptiles, right? So 1 million insects, 50,000 vertebrates. So they're important just because there's so many of them. I have always thought of them as kind of like mini superheroes. And so because of that, they do all these ecosystem services. And it has been valued that they do ecosystem services up to over $50 billion annually. So hopefully we've got some pictures for you guys coming. So I'm just going to show you some of the ecosystem services that they do, why they're important. The first couple examples are nutrient cycling. So here are some dung beetles and some termites, and they do a lot of decomposition and bringing back carbon and nitrogen to the soil for plants to grow. Another one that insects are most famous for is pollination. And so instead of putting a bee, I actually put a fly here, which also they do a lot of pollination as well. And seed dispersal, it's kind of less known. So here are some ants doing some seed dispersal. And then also biological control. So this one is a little bit less thought of, I think, when people think why insects are important. But it's super important for this because we're probably going to talk about pesticides is a problem for insects. And in order for us to reduce our reliance on pesticides, we need to reduce or increase reliance on biological control. So there's a picture of a wasp parasitizing a larvae. And then finally, the last picture I have, a dragonfly larva. And I have that up because another reason that insects are so important is because they indicate the health of ecosystems. And so particularly like aquatic organisms like dragonflies and mayflies, caddisflies, they can really tell us based on their diversity and abundance, like how healthy water quality is, which obviously is very important for us. And finally, they just form the basis of the food chain. They're so important to all those vertebrates for their food. And, a lot of recent studies have linked the declines of insects to decline of birds. So, yeah.
Wow, that's really cool about the water quality. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So there are, as you said, a lot of different species of insects and a lot of insects in general. So what is happening with insect populations globally?
Yeah, so this is kind of a big question. So if you guys can all bear with me, I'm going to go through some of the evidence with you all. So probably a lot of you saw the feature in the New York Times Magazine or some kind of press, in the last 2 or 3 years about an insect apocalypse. Insects are declining. Something's going on with our insects. And one of the reasons that started happening was because this paper in PLOS One here was published. And this is depicting one of the most important graphs from the German study. I think that they're linking to that right now. And the reason that this study was important is because it was very long term. So these people went out and they measured the biomass. So that's like the sheer weight of insects, which you can see is on the y-axis there. And they measured it almost 30 years. And they found over those 30 years that there was about a 75% decline in the sheer weight of insects. So that was pretty stark. And the other thing they found is that each year about 3% declined. And so if they were just looking at 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, it would be difficult for them to figure out that trend, right? So the long-term data set was really important. The reason why this was, they actually didn't look into causes, but the authors concluded that because the land changed around where they studied this, that they concluded it was probably increase in agriculture intensification and pesticide use. So, many studies are finding these kinds of same things, maybe not quite this decline, but a lot of studies are finding upwards declines of 30 to 40% per 30 to 40 years. So 10% per decade. In some cases about 2 to 3 annually, which is on the high end. However, the information is becoming really more nuanced, more specific, and we're starting to realize, okay, we really have to look at what information we've got for what part of the world and what kinds of insects, right? As I just told you, they're super diverse. And so it became more nuanced. So this title here, the meta-analysis, was for a study that came out this year. And a meta-analysis is like a study of studies, right? And so what they did was to look at insect data sets that were 10 years or more, so complete data sets. And as you can see from the headline, it says what they found was that they found declines in terrestrial insects, but not freshwater. They found increases in freshwater. So if you can click on the next one, the graph should show up here. So I put a graph, perfect, from one of the, from this paper, one of the graphs. And what this is showing is kind of the general trend, negative or positive, of terrestrial, which is in that like brownish color, versus freshwater, which is in the bluish color. And they did it throughout the continents of the world. So if you click again, there's like some arrows that will appear. And I just, right, perfect. I just want to point out sort of the columns. And you can see that the first numbers are the number of studies for each region, and the next are the number of sites. So clearly, we've got a super biased number of studies that are done in Europe and North America, right? So a lot of our knowledge comes from the Northern Hemisphere. So it's hard to make those, you know, generalizations to the rest of the world. So studies are still being done. Also, even though this overall sort of generalizing study found that there were general increases in freshwater insects, you know, we know from some more specific studies like this one here that that can't be, again, that can't be generalized. So another study that came out here this year was looking at burrowing mayflies, they're called. So it's a genus of mayflies in the upper Mississippi River. And what this graph is showing you is the change in mayfly abundance as well as biomass. And what this study went from like 2012 to 2019, it looks like, and they compared the abundance and biomass of mayflies currently to a study that was done in the past. So you can see that like the abundance of mayflies in the past, you know, kind of fluctuated a whole bunch, but on the whole, it was generally around the same. Whereas now they calculated a 50% decline in these mayflies. So clearly, even though this generalized study found increases in freshwater insects, you know, we can't generalize. So that's kind of the moral of that story. In the US, I'm just gonna tell you about a couple specific studies that have been done in the US. One that got pretty good press as well was monitoring butterflies in Ohio. And what this found, they looked at 81 species of butterflies, and they found a total abundance declining about 2% per year, so pretty high. And that resulted over the 20 years of the study in a cumulative decline of 33% of butterfly abundance. And here's a picture of one of the species that they found to be declining significantly, the hoary edge skipper, cute little butterfly there. A lot of studies in the US have also looked at bumblebees. Bumblebees are studied very well. You know, clearly they're very cute. People love them. And this study was looking at the health of bumblebees. So I really like this one because the graph is so clear, right? So in North America, we have about 47 species of bumblebees known. For some reason, just a side note, they separated Mexico from the US and Canada and North America. I think it's because the species are so much more similar to Central America than the other continent or the other countries. So it's showing, you know, out of those 47 bumblebee species, a full 26% of them are threatened according to the IUCN, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. That's a huge amount, right? And then if we look more in the Central American Mexican species, we've got almost 50% of them are threatened with extinction. So, you know, it really does depend on where you look and in what types of taxa you look. Okay, and then finally, why is this happening? Well, there was this review also came out a couple years ago that was really important. And one of the things that I think this review really contributed to our knowledge was the drivers of insect decline. And if you can kind of see, I know it's a little bit blurry, but if you see, the biggest parts of this pie are related to intensive agriculture. So land use change, pesticide use, fertilizer use. Some other big components are other types of loss of habitat, wetlands, rivers, as well as diseases, which is an important reason for bumblebee decline. And then climate change, right? The more climate change kind of gets worse and gets studied, it becomes more clearly that it's impacting species, not only because of temperature and precipitation changes, but also increases in carbon dioxide can actually alter like the nutrition of plants. And so that's something that's just starting to be looked at as well. So clearly, you know, insects are understudied. We need more work. They're difficult to monitor sometimes, especially the rare species. But we know enough, right? We know enough that we can act now, that we can actually do things. We know the drivers to stop, you know, some of these declines.
Thank you for sharing all that.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, so my next question's for Tierra. And, you know, this insect in particular is, you know, one that we all know and probably love. What's going on with the monarch butterfly?
So monarch butterflies, all of them, the super generation migrates from the northern United States and Canada to Mexico to overwinter, and then they fly north again in the spring. And then several generations are born over the summer. So right now, while we're on this webinar, the monarchs are beginning to pull up for their migration. And scientists started counting them in the mountains of Mexico in the mid-1990s by measuring the area of forest that is turned orange by the clustering butterflies. This is a photo that my colleague Brett Hartle took of the monarchs just clustered on the Oyamel fir in Mexico. And so in the mid-1990s, when scientists started counting them, there were about 1 billion monarchs in the eastern population, and that steadily declined by about 80% over the last 25 years. Last winter, there were only about 112 million monarchs, and the number of monarchs that the governmental scientists estimate is needed for them to avoid extinction and for the migration to continue is 6 hectares of forested habitat covered in the winter, or about 225 million butterflies. So right now they're at about half of that level, and they had a pretty bad year last year. So why are monarchs declining? There's a lot of reasons. A big one is pesticides, herbicides that kill milkweed. Milkweed is the monarch caterpillar's only food source. And so because of industrial agriculture and the use of herbicides and also just urban sprawl taking over, you know, previous farm and open habitat, there's a lot fewer monarchs than there used to be. Insecticides, such as neonicotinoid insecticides that are really widely used now and really came into use over the last 20 years, are toxic to young monarch larvae. And then monarchs are also really vulnerable to climate change because of their migration and their overwintering habitat. So severe storms in the winter, if it's too hot, if there's drought, the drought is bad for the butterflies and the milkweed that they eat. And just like right now, a huge storm of derecho went through Iowa and caused a lot of devastation to people and to butterflies and to habitat. And so with climate change, the migration is at risk of being disrupted. And some scientists predict that the monarch's entire overwintering habitat in Mexico, where they go to cluster because it's cooler, is going to become too hot for them. And let's see, I think those are the biggest ones. There's another idea that monarchs are harmed during the fall migration because of lack of nectar flowers and just habitat fragmentation and also insecticide residuals, so that they don't get to Mexico in good enough shape to survive the winter and then fly north again. So lots of things.
Wow. Whew. And then so another insect that I would like to ask Tara about is one that means a lot to me as someone who grew up on the East Coast, and they're fireflies. And I remember catching them all the time when I was a little kid, and whenever I go back to visit now, I barely see any. So are they also declining?
Yeah, that's a good question. Oh, thanks. There's our picture of my firefly. You know, fireflies are kind of a great example insect for what I was talking about, you know, how we have to look more at the data and more nuanced, and some species are doing okay, some aren't doing okay. And the thing with fireflies is that, just like you said, Brittany, the biggest evidence that we have for their decline is actually kind of anecdotal. You know, people like you and me, I also grew up in the East area. Some people would say Midwest, you know, and with fireflies surrounding me. And, you know, people like you and me have noticed the decline. Professional firefly scientists have also noticed the decline, you know, going out and monitoring them. But it's important to remember too, and just this year we kind of realized, or not just this year, but like in the last few years, we've realized that we've got about 168 species of fireflies in North America. So that's a lot, right? And so, first of all, I wanted to mention, probably everyone knows this, but just in case, fireflies are actually beetles. not flies. Just want to make that point. Back to the beetles. So we do lack kind of long-term monitoring data of fireflies. But like I said, anecdotally, they seem to be declining. Of course, this does depend on the species. There is one species, like they call it either the common eastern firefly or the Big Dipper firefly, which is more of a fun name to me. That one is doing pretty well. You know, it's adapted to urban areas. You can actually see it in New York City and some of the other big cities on the East Coast. But that said, most fireflies have traits that make them highly susceptible to human activity. A lot of them are really habitat specialists, so they need to live in wet areas. So usually they're found in either temporary wetlands or freshwater wetlands, sometimes in like mangrove areas in Florida or wet forests. Also, even though we're so used to seeing them flying around blinking at each other, you know, there's quite a few that have females that don't fly at all when they're adults. And so as a result of that, they don't move very much. And so they're really susceptible to their habitat being changed and modified. Also, not all of them do use light to communicate, but a lot of them do. And of course, that means that light pollution is a really big issue for them. And, you know, as urbanization increases on our coastal areas and in our wet areas, light pollution becomes more and more of an issue. They also spend most of their life as a larvae. Of course, we're so used to catching these adults and seeing these adults, but they're only this stage for about like 3 weeks. The rest of the time, the rest of the year, maybe even 2 years, they're larvae in the soil or in the leaf litter. And so because of that, they're also susceptible to ground changes. The larvae are also carnivores, they're predators, and they eat soft-bodied arthropods like snails and, Tierra, slugs and worms. So because of that, they're really susceptible to pesticides that impact those organisms as well. They're also threatened by pesticides from mosquito spraying. They live in wet areas, and you know that's usually an area where mosquito populations are also very high. And of course, because they are found around like fresh water near oceans, or sometimes in some cases in coastal areas, they're impacted by sea level rise. So the intrusion of salt water into that fresh water as well. So far, none of the species are protected under the Endangered Species Act. But last year, I and the Xerces Society petitioned to list the Bethany Beach firefly. And this is a species that lives in Delaware. It's only found in about like 5 tiny locations on the Delaware coast. It's being totally, you know, threatened with extinction from urbanization, light pollution, mosquito pesticide spraying, sea level rise definitely is an issue for this one. And so we petitioned to get it listed, and so, you know, it's being reviewed right now by the Fish and Wildlife Service.
Thanks for talking more about fireflies, and, you know, even just comparing that to the monarch and just how sensitive both of these insects are to, you know, just human intervention into their lives and pesticides and things like that. You know, just really makes me want to reconsider, you know, things that I use and, you know, such. But I also didn't know that fireflies are beetles. I just never considered it. But so with that, I want to ask, what is your favorite insect, Tara?
So my favorite insect, I think if you go to the next one, here we go. This is a picture of it. So I mentioned early on in my introduction that I did my PhD at UC Santa Cruz, and my entire dissertation was on this one beetle here. This is the Ohlone tiger beetle. It's an endangered species. It was listed, oh gosh, no, I'm like forgetting, blanking. I think 2001, I want to say. So it's been listed as an endangered species for about 20 years now. And when I went down to study it in about 2008, there really was not much information known about it. So I did a lot of really basic research, so sort of like habitat nest requirements, population viability analysis, the impact of mountain biking recreation on the beetle. So the cool thing about tiger beetles is that they're predators. They're predators as adults. As you can see in the close-up picture, they've got really big jaws. And they're also predators as larvae. And because of that, they really need specific habitat. And as you also can see in the picture, they have big eyes, right? And so they're visual hunters. And so they actually like look for their prey. And because of that, they need open spaces, kind of flat, open ground. So you'll find them on bare ground areas and prairies, which is kind of in like the picture, all of these. That's where this guy is in Santa Cruz County. Sometimes they're on like mud flats and deserts, in dunes. The one I studied for my master's degree is in the sand dunes, salt flats, that kind of thing. So they like those kinds of open areas, which, you know, are not super common. And unfortunately, a lot of those areas either get developed or they get covered with invasive plants. So in this case, this tiger beetle is threatened by invasive grasses, European grasses in California. Even though I did I finished my PhD working on this guy, did some publications on it, I still continue to work on the species today. And that picture down in the right-hand corner is of me doing a project to reintroduce the beetle into a former habitat that has been restored. So I worked with Fish and Wildlife Service to do that just this past early March, right before, the COVID, upturned all of our lives. So, so this is my favorite species.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I love this conversation because I'm learning about so many, different insects and, creatures that I really didn't know about. But one that I did is the monarch, like most of us. And I'm curious why the monarch gets so much conservation attention compared to maybe other, even butterflies. And Tierra, if you want to answer that.
People really, really love monarch butterflies. I have been blown away. I've been working on them since 2013, and people just want to call me sometimes and talk about monarchs, or even reporters will tell me about the time when they were a kid and a monarch butterfly landed in their hair. So I think one reason people care about them so much is because they're so familiar. They're found in all 48 states and Hawaii. They are in people's yards and gardens, and they used to be really, really common. And a lot of kids learned about metamorphosis by watching monarch butterflies, and metamorphosis is just amazing, and that instills a sense of wonder about nature and a love for the natural world. And because they're so widespread, they're kind of a flagship for other pollinators. So I think they get a lot of conservation attention because if we can save the monarch, because it covers so much territory and it migrates across the whole country, then we can save habitat for a lot of other pollinators. The monarch is also culturally important across all 3 North American countries. In Canada and the United States, it's around in summer. So it's like a symbol of playing outside and working in your garden. But in Mexico, where they go for the winter, they show up on the Day of the Dead. And so in Mexican folklore, they represent the souls of departed loved ones. And there's parades and all of these amazing dresses. And the monarchs are, in good years, there's just millions and millions of them around. I got to go see them last winter, and I was talking to my guide, and he said when he was a little kid, his first memory of them was he was terrified because they weren't there in the summer, and then all of a sudden in the winter there's just butterflies everywhere. But now he loves them. And so I think that if we can save the monarch, we can help a lot of pollinators, and we can also save something that a lot of people love and deeply care about. Oh, I should mention, this is a mural that Roger Pete painted as part of our endangered species mural project in Minneapolis a couple of years ago, and it emphasizes their migration.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, I love monarchs. I love when I get the rare chance to still see them. So it's really special, just their, the way they cross cultures too, and the way they cross, invisible boundaries, made up boundaries. But because we all love monarchs, how can we help save them? Is there anything that we can do to, protect them?
Yes, and that's also something I love about monarchs is for a lot of species, to save the polar bear, we have to fight climate change, and we have to fight climate change to save the monarch too. And we can fight for policy and make the lifestyle changes, but it's not as satisfying as to save the monarch. You can plant flowers, and you can plant milkweed, which is the monarch caterpillar's only food source. And so that is very satisfying to go out in your yard and put some flowers in the dirt. So everyone can help. One important thing is to support Endangered Species Act protection for the monarch. We petitioned for its protection as a threatened species back in 2014, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is going to issue that decision this December. And this upset a lot of people because they wanted to be able to handle monarchs and watch the caterpillars metamorphose, and they thought that it would be a crime to continue to handle the monarchs. And so there's been a lot of confusion about that, and Endangered Species Act protection wouldn't make it illegal necessarily for people to handle them, because we specifically ask for a special rule that would allow citizen scientists to continue to tag them and people to still interact with them, because it's not like we want to just set them off where people can't interact with them, because people love them and people are a big part of saving them. So that decision will come out in December, and you guys can take action by responding to the action alert and asking Fish and Wildlife Service to protect them. Another thing that Endangered Species Act protection would do is it would keep the funding that they've been getting since the petition going. They've gotten millions of dollars in funding for habitat restoration, but if a negative decision comes out and they don't get protected and their listing isn't looming on the horizon, that funding and all the conservation efforts are at risk of drying up. Oppose pesticides, don't use them, also oppose them, get involved in the policy battles to change their regulation, and you can get involved at the local level by trying to get your local parks or schools to go organic, or getting your school to plant a pollinator garden. Fight climate change, which could undermine their migration. And a big one is to support the communities in Mexico where the monarchs overwinter. The mountains in Mexico where they go are surrounded by communities that are very rural and very poor. Like, a lot of them don't have electricity or running water, and they depend on that wood. So by protecting the monarch trees, they're giving up a source of income from those trees. And so because monarchs are something that people in northern North America, Canada, and the United States value, we should help support those communities. And you can do that. This is a photo of a butterfly B&B where it's in the town of Macheros. There's a nonprofit called Butterflies and Their People, and I was really lucky to be there on a day. There's 80 people who live in this town, and they did a fundraiser and got a bag of horse vitamins and a new pair of hiking boots for each of the 80 guides in that town who like rotate through taking you up to the mountains to see the butterflies. There's also nonprofits that are specifically focused on supporting those communities. So there's lots of ways that everyone can get involved in helping to save the monarch.
Thank you for sharing all that, Tierra. And I'm going to definitely keep an eye out for the action alert that will be coming in an email to you after this webinar. Super important to take action. And then another really cool campaign that the center has is the Saving Insects campaign. So Tara, do you want to let everyone know how they can get involved with that?
Sure. Yeah. So the easiest way probably for you to learn more and get involved is, to sign up for our newsletters, become a member, support the center's work in any way you can, whether it's just, signing petitions, which is awesome. And you'll get information, newsletters from the center that will contain any kind of activity that we're currently doing, whether we're trying to get a species listed under the endangered that may be impacting critical habitat of an already listed species. Those kinds of things are always in that information that goes out to those people. We also have some really cool pages on the center's website. If you go kind of Saving the Insects and look up our website, we've got some cool pages. I highly recommend the Firefly one because it actually has like some music and some lights to it, so check that out. And all of those pages, there's one on fireflies and butterflies, native bees, and some others, and you can check that out, tiger beetles, I think. And see kind of what we're doing. Also, what's really important is to just do some of your own efforts to actually, try to conserve insects. And I was lucky enough to be part of an international group of scientists who published this paper. The citation is kind of on the bottom there. It's called a Roadmap for Insect Conservation and Recovery. And in that paper, it's pretty short. It's mostly diagrams, like this one. I think, yeah, they're linking it now. So in this one, what we tried to figure out is, okay, what are some things we can do? Now we call them, as you can see, immediate actions, no regret solutions. And then there are some other ones in the paper as well that are sort of like longer term. But included in this, of course, it's for policymakers, but also individuals. And things obviously like not using pesticides, in your yard or any land or any plants, even on your balcony that you take care of. If you have a lawn, mowing that lawn less often or at a higher height. leaving any kind of like bare ground if you have it. Bare ground, as I told you, for tiger beetles is so important. You probably don't have tiger beetles necessarily in your yard, but you might have ground nesting bees. You probably do, and they need bare ground as well. One thing that people don't really think about is like what we call, as you somewhere on this round thing here, is heterogeneous habitat. So that means like habitat of different structures. You know, we've got some tall grass or some bushes and some trees. So things that just kind of vary, you know, because some insects use bushes, some use trees, you know, and spiders will love all of it. Also, leaving leaf litter is another really important one in the fall when I walk around and I see people with bags of leaves in their front yard. You know, it kind of drives me nuts because leaf litter is such an important overwintering habitat. It's an important larval habitat for many insects, including lots of moths and butterflies. And then light pollution, right? Like I was saying earlier, light pollution is becoming more and more of a known threat to lots of insects. And so if you could turn off lights at night, you know, reduce the lights that are unnecessary, kind of cover them as well so they don't sort of project into the sky, lots of things like that. Also, you know, if you're up for it, organizing your neighborhood or your city or your town to try to become pesticide free in the public parks, create pollinator habitat and rights of ways, all that kind of stuff. So there's lots of ways to save the insects, you know, from your own home.
Thank you. And thank you both so much for sharing all of your knowledge about monarchs and fireflies and insects and beetles. This was really cool. I feel like I learned a lot. So I'm going to give like a clap for y'all. And then also thank you, Karina, for running some back-end tech. And with that, everyone's favorite part of a webinar, the question and answer slides. So I'm gonna start off. We have about 20 minutes for question and answers. And if your question does not get answered today, tomorrow Tara will be on from 12 to 1 p.m. Pacific time to answer any other questions and to have a conversation or to finish this conversation or start it, however you look at it. With that, I will ask the first question, which is, are people exposed to pesticides in their daily lives in suburbs and cities?
Can you guys hear me? Yeah, okay, it just said your internet is unstable. Anyways. Yeah, so it definitely depends on where you live, but for the most part, yes, in areas to reduce, you know, certain things that are considered pests. You know, you can find this out by talking to your like local public parks to see if that's the case. I live in Portland, Oregon, and here, you know, we worked hard to try to, before I moved here, I can't like, you know, take credit, but to try to ban, you know, to ban neonicotinoid usage in public parks, and that's successful, except for the rose gardens. So if you've ever been to Portland, you'll know that the rose gardens are very special here, and so they're beautiful. But they do kind of reserve that using neonics. To the credit of the parks, though, they're trying to find ways to not use them. They're doing some studies to try to figure out how to get around that. So I would say in general, you could be, you know, it also depends on what your neighbor's using. You know, if there's any pesticide spraying aerially going on. There's lots of factors, you know, that could make you exposed or not.
And I would just add that if people are interested in pesticides in particular, last week's webinar was all about them. So if you go to savelifeonearth.org or savinglifeonearth.org, either one, and scroll down to the bottom to the speaker series, Lori Ann Bird and Nate Donnelly talked about pesticides for an hour last week. So check out that video.
I highly recommend that. Yeah, Nate Donnelly, the scientist who spoke on that, is a plethora of knowledge for pesticides. Yes. So please check him out. He knows way more than me.
Yeah, thank you for answering and plugging last week's webinar. And so the next question is, how can people find native milkweed/wildflowers to plant in their own gardens? Is there like a resource online somewhere?
That is a really good question, because I just moved and went through this because I didn't, if you plant flowers that have been grown from seeds that were treated with neonics or have been treated with neonics as a plant, then you can harm the pollinators you're trying to help. And so I just moved to rural Kentucky, and there's not very many places around here. I called up all the nurseries to ask them about neonics, and most of them thought I was a space alien and had no idea what I was talking about. And one of them was like, oh yeah, those are bad. We wouldn't use those. We like do organic as much as we can. So I went to that place. I also went to Lowe's because Lowe's was supposed to phase out neonics by this year. And they didn't have any information. They said it came down from corporate. I looked on their website. I wrote them. They didn't get back to me. And I ended up looking up, like taking pictures on my cell phone of each of the tags of the companies they sell flowers from and looking them up individually. And that took a long time, but I didn't want to like see a beautiful butterfly land in my yard and drink poison. And so some of the companies had clear statements on their websites that they're not using neonics, and some didn't. Some said that they use pesticides as needed. And so it just takes a lot of research. The Xerces Society has a native milkweed finder on their website, and you can also just call around or check out the Xerces native milkweed finder. One thing is that milkweed is really important in the spring and early summer, but in the fall, when the monarchs are getting ready to go back to Mexico, they need to put on as much weight as they can, and they'll nectar on hundreds of different flowers. So any sort of late summer, early fall blooming flower will help them out. And tropical, don't plant tropical milkweed, but any of the native milkweeds are great.
Thank you for sharing that. Very good information to have.
And that goes for, I was just going to add, that also goes for lots of other insects, particularly bumblebees. They really need that floral resources from early spring all the way through late fall. So always helpful.
Thank you. And next question is, what are specific ways to support the communities in Mexico near the monarchs?
Yeah, so there's a lot of nonprofits that are focused on those communities. There's a concept called payment for ecosystem services, which is where people outside of where a resource is support that resource because of all of the good things it does for other people. One of the nonprofits is called Butterflies and Their People, and they employ the people in their community to go be foresters and take care of the woods and the trees, and then they run tours and they have a little bed and breakfast. But there's lots of other groups as well. And then just if you go to Mexico to see the butterflies, spend money. There's people who, that's the only time of year that they work. When I was there, I went to 4 different sanctuaries and talked to the guides, and one of them was like a young mother who worked 3 months of the year during the butterfly season and left her kids with her mom. And another one came, he had to go to the city seasonally to work in the city, but then he would come back to guide during the butterfly season. So support the people around the communities.
Yeah. Okay, next question was a very popular question, which is, what are your thoughts on genetically modified mosquitoes being released in Texas and Florida?
Boy, that's a tough one. Yeah. So, you know, I would say, it's a tough one. I can't really say for or against either way. Clearly pesticide spraying is awful, and it's really impacting a lot of insects. And the more we could stop it, the better. Also, clearly, we have to protect human health. And there are a lot of diseases that can be brought, especially with climate change, with more and more mosquitoes. So, I can't really say like either way. I think it would have to be kind of circumstantial, depending on the circumstance, depending on the amount released, the area released, the evidence that for success in studies would be good. In general, the actual individual mosquito itself, or, they're usually, I believe they usually release like sterile males just to kind of flood the population. That wouldn't be, males don't actually like bite and suck blood. They actually are pollinators while they go to flowers. I don't know how much pollen they get on them. They're so tiny. But that would, those would not, I can't imagine, be entirely harmful. I'm not sure of a reason, unless, maybe you guys could say. But yeah, but it's always good to be cautious about releasing organisms into, you know, an ecosystem. So I would just be cautious, but of course we do want to reduce pesticides and at the same time, human health issues.
Anytime we're talking about a genetically modified animal, it's kind of terrifying.
Yeah.
I'll just add that.
It is terrifying, yeah. And this
so wrong.
This one's a tough one, you know. Yeah, so much could go wrong, but at the same time, like, you know, doing pesticides and not doing anything is also scary. So yeah,
like the Miami blue butterfly and a lot of endemic butterflies are very threatened by mosquito control pesticides.
Yeah, we just petitioned, well, it's been a couple of years now, but we petitioned for the Gulf Coast solitary bee, which occurs on the Gulf Coast of Florida. And it used to be in Mississippi and Alabama as well. And same thing, you know, as those butterflies, it's impacted by that as well, and mosquito spraying.
And on the mosquito conversation a little bit more, what are some safe alternatives for pest and mosquito control?
So when I get ants in my kitchen, I put cinnamon or cayenne pepper all over the place. It's always funny when I put cayenne pepper all over my counter. They don't like it, and it seems to work. You know, I put it I follow their path, and then I put the cayenne pepper like in their path and where else they would go. And, you know, it takes them a couple of days, but eventually they're like, they don't like it. They just stop coming. I'm laughing because it's funny to have people over and they're just like, what's going on? Why is there all this? I'm like, don't touch it. Don't touch your face. You know, this is pre-COVID times, having people over, of course. Yeah, so I do that. Also, you know, just be aware of maybe what they're going for. I realized that I had, you know, this cute little ceramic thing of sugar on my counter and some honey on my counter for tea. And as soon as I moved that to an area that they couldn't get to, kind of like an island kind of thing, they went away. So there's that too.
Yeah, I also had used cayenne pepper for ants and a small mouse problem we had, and I had looked it up. So I felt very silly, like putting cayenne pepper in water and spraying it and like just leaving like red pepper all over the place. But it did work. Yeah. Eventually, so glad to hear it confirmed by an expert.
Yeah, I still have it on my counter.
At least it's a nice color.
Yeah.
And then switching from the, you know, kind of pest control mosquitoes, people want to know, why not tropical milkweed?
Okay, so this has been pretty controversial, but tropical milkweed doesn't die back in warm places. So Florida, Texas, California, it blooms year round. The monarchs don't migrate. They get really lazy and hang out around the tropical milkweed instead of joining the migration. And because they hang out there, they're clustered together and they are less healthy and they're more at risk of getting a parasite called OE. And OE can keep caterpillars from becoming monarch butterflies. So the migration actually helps get rid of makes the monarchs healthier and gets rid of the parasites. So if you do plant tropical milkweed and you don't live somewhere where it'll die back, cut it down in late summer so that the migration queue doesn't get mixed up. But in general, it's just better to plant native plants than invasive plants.
Yeah, definitely always native plants make a bigger impact in your garden.
Right, but I would like to add just a quick caveat to that, because I think it's also important that if you do have, you know, non-native, non-invasive flowers in your backyard and you're not ready to actually like plant native plants, when you rip those out, maybe don't rip them out, because a lot of times they are being used. So, I mean, if you're like gung-ho and ready to rip out your non-native, non-invasive plants and plant natives, fantastic. But if you are just going to rip out non-native, non-invasive flowers, that makes me a little bit wary, because I've seen that happen. And you know, there's a lot of generalist pollinators out there that will go to non-native flowers. I mean, of course, invasive plants, on the other hand, can be very damaging. But there are some that are non-native that aren't going to spread. Just a little plug I like to give.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so we got another question that was popular again about pests, pest control, and it's, do you discourage people from buying insects like ladybugs or mantises for pest control in their gardens?
Yeah, I do. This is tricky also because clearly you don't want to use pesticides. But a lot of the ladybugs are non-native that you can buy. If you can find some person who is, you know, growing native ladybugs, great. But unfortunately, the 9-spotted ladybug, which used to be really common, is actually really rare now. And the main reason that it is because of garden release of 7-spotted ladybug and a couple other non-native ladybugs, unfortunately. So it can have bad repercussions. So if you can find native, you know, species to do that, then that's great.
Thank you. So another question is, how important are Monarch Chrysalis attachments, and do we need to help them get out of the chrysalis?
You definitely don't need to help them get out of the chrysalis. This is another really controversial thing because a paper came out recently saying that monarchs reared in the dark in a lab couldn't orient to migrate successfully. And so there was a lot of debate and dialogue about that. And what it comes down to is they need the daylight cues. So a lot of times if you've got a caterpillar or in your garden, you want to cover it or bring it inside because that's what people want to do. People love doing that, right? So it's better to cover it outside to keep things from eating it because lots of things want to eat it. If you do bring it inside, make sure that you bleach out your container between caterpillars to kill any disease spores, and also that you put it like right by a window so that it gets those daylight cues. And there's lots of best practices online for this. And also you can join citizen science programs. Like if you're handling monarchs and doing that sort of thing, you should report your data to Journey North and other groups that are focused exclusively on monarch butterflies and follow the best management guidelines.
Thank you. Okay, so we have time for a few more questions. So we have a kind of broader question now, which is, how does vehicle impactions affect, first question is, how does climate change affect insect populations, with a follow-up related to that after, but first question.
Yeah, many ways. Yeah, so first of all, just direct temperature increases can actually change the ranges of insects. There's a recent study on bumblebees showing that extreme hot days impacted the range of bumblebees. So there's that direct kind of connection there. Another way is through what's known as phenological mismatch, which just means bad timing, basically. And so right now, you know, insects that are maybe specialized on certain flowers, they come out at the same time that those flowers do. They you know, come out of their chrysalis, or they come out of their egg in order to eat those host plants. With climate change, you know, plants and insects respond to different cues. So with climate change, the cues can change, the precipitation or the temperatures can change, whether at the night or the day. And so that can kind of cause a timing mismatch between host plants and insects. So that's another reason. Another way, kind of, I mentioned it, something I've always been curious about, so I was excited to see this new study. Increases in CO2 changes the nutrient composition of plants. You know, plants take in carbon dioxide or carbon, and then they, you know, they are able to grow different various leaves and reproductive, and so there's nitrogen and phosphorus involved. And the insect that is an herbivore needs all of that, right? But increased CO2 has actually, in one study at least, in the Kanza Prairie in Kansas, showed that it decreased the nutritional value of plants to grasshoppers, and in turn impacted the grasshopper. So that is something that I think is really concerning and understudied.
And every insect, or pretty much every animal, has a different set of thermal tolerances. And so like monarch caterpillars and adults have upper temperature limits. There's scientists who think that the resident population in Florida is going to get wiped out by climate change just because it will become too hot for the monarch caterpillars to survive there.
Thank you for answering that. And the follow-up question to that, or related question, was how does vehicle impactions affect the insect population?
Oh, that's a good question, and it's not studied very much. There are a few studies, and some of them are kind of, I mean, Tierra can speak more to this for monarchs too. There are studies that do show that it can be really, you know, negatively impactful in some cases, just particularly where there's like a high density of cars that go at a high speed. On the other hand, you know, roadside vegetation and milkweed planting is, you know, something that's real.
Tara.
On like the speed and the density of the.
All right, Tara looks like she is frozen.
Uh-oh. I think you guys froze.
Uh-oh, everybody's frozen.
Oops.
All right.
Okay, I think we might be unfrozen now.
Yeah, you're unfrozen now.
Okay, good. Anyways, I don't know if Tierra, you want to add something. I don't know what everyone heard.
It's a really hard one. One of the things that's happening to try to save the monarchs is milkweed planting along the interstate from Laredo to Duluth. And is it a good idea to plant milkweed on an interstate with huge trucks going by at high speeds? I don't think we should put all of our eggs in that basket to save the monarch, but in places like rural country roads where it can be set back, it's a better idea.
Great. Oh, somebody actually just wrote, I just opened the Q&A and made a good point. Maybe not direct vehicle collisions, but exhaust increases the nitrogen in the soil and really can impact insects, particularly like in California, where the invasive grasses thrive off of the nitrogen along highways 280 and all the big highways. And that has already impacted like the Kino checker spot butterfly and the bay checker spot butterfly, for instance. So exhaust from cars can be bad too.
Yeah. Okay, so we have no minutes technically left. It's top of the hour, but lightning round, last question. How important are people planting their own pollinator gardens at home? Like, does it really make an impact?
It really makes an impact. Plant your pollinator garden for sure.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for tuning in. We had a bunch of people on the webinar today. And tomorrow, Tara will be on Slack. So if you wanted to ask more questions or talk more about any of the questions that we talked about today, join us 12 to 1 p.m. on Slack, and you'll get information on that in the follow-up email that will be headed your way after this call. And then next week, we have a webinar from the Center Action Fund, which is our sister organization, and they'll be launching the Vote for Life on Earth campaign. And then on the 3rd, Tierra and I will be back to talk with folks about saving sea turtles. So yeah, fun-filled September.
Awesome.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, everyone.